Thank you.
This is working?
Yes.
Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, I know it's been a long day for you, and I'm very pleased and flattered to be asked to moderate this. You will not be hearing a great deal from me, except to try to keep things flowing. One thing I'm not worried about excessively is any questions from the floor, but I need to ask Mark if that's all right. And secondly, how much time do we have? So
it depends on actually, I think, some of the participants.
Okay.
I think 5:30?
Yeah.
Is it about 5:30?
That's right. All right, let's aim at about 5:30. I'm here largely because my long and old friend Ribal Al-Assad, on whose advisory board in the Amman Foundation I serve, suggested I should come along. It's been a fascinating opportunity for me to do that. No need to belabor the prestige and the background of the people who are up here on the floor with me. Most of my work, luckily, from the point of view of the topic, has been in Asia, where I concern myself with the rise of China. Those of you around tomorrow, we can get into that. But at the moment, it's hard to think of a more enervating, troubling, dispiriting conflict than that which is raging in Syria these days. It's a troubling thing because of friends that I have who are deeply involved in it, troubling because I was involved with some of the problems when I was in the American government in the Middle East, and the way in which all of our efforts have seemed to come to nothing. What I'd like to do is invite Ribal Al-Assad to offer some comments at the moment, and then really, because I'm being asked to be moderator, I'm going to be fairly strict and ask that each of us here in front of you confine ourselves to a short period of time so that we do give you a chance, if you wish, to ask some questions. So Ribal, could I hand you the phone, or you've got it already?
Thank you very much, James.
To welcome Ribal Al-Assad, who's the chairman of the Amman Foundation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much, my dear friend James. Thank you, Dr. Nizar. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, all of you, for accepting to be on this panel. Well, we all know where the situation, I think, in Syria is today. We are at a stage where that actually I've been warning from for the past 2 years and a half, over past 2 years and a half. The country, unfortunately, have been completely destroyed by both sides. We have, on one side, a tyrannical regime that is not ready to give up, their seats, and on the other side, you have an opposition that got more and more extreme. And as you have heard recently from the latest news, that most of rebel-held areas are under the control of extremist groups. A lot of them, of course, affiliated to Al-Qaeda, and others Salafi extremist groups who are, again, for some people, they would consider them, of course, not as much as extreme as Al-Qaeda, but we all know that they share the same ideology. It's very sad because we could have, prevented that from happening. We could have prevented that situation from the beginning. When those peaceful protesters went into the streets and chanting 111 as one people against the dictatorship. At that time, yes, there was hope. We could have continued on putting pressure on that regime to accept more, to accept political parties to be formed in Syria, to accept, to give freedom, and for sure to have a transitional democratic change. Unfortunately, this is where we have not stepped in. When I mean by we, when I talk about the West, where I grew up since I was 9 years old, I talk about Europe, I talk about the United States, where they decided to stand in the back and allow countries such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others to take the lead. And as we all know, those countries do not share the same interest as we have. They certainly do not want to see genuine democracies taking over those countries where they have been in Arab Spring, because they know very well that this could be a contagious process and a domino effect, which would, of course, reach their own countries. So this is why you could see countries such as Egypt, Tunisia, and others, where there were a competition between actually Qatar and Saudi Arabia, each one wanting to promote their own notion of Islamist extremism. The Qataris were backing the Muslim Brotherhood. The Saudis, on the other hand, were backing the Salafis. This is what it got us to. Unfortunately, again, we allowed those countries to form the opposition group, the recognized, now by 120 countries, the Syrian National, started by the Syrian National Council, which was a group of people, they gathered them in Turkey. 80% of them were members of the Muslim Brotherhood. And then it took Mrs. Clinton, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, 18 months to recognize that those people do not actually represent the Syrian people. And at that time, again, there was hope because we thought that they know now what really, that they were wrong. They know now that those people do not represent the Syrian people, that the process that they chose was not a democratic process to choose this opposition, and that maybe they were going to fix it. Unfortunately, they went to Qatar, so it moved from Turkey and then Qatar. And in Qatar, again, they brought around 270 people into a room, and they said, well, these are the recognized, opposition of, Syrian opposition, again, without any democratic process. And this has showed the Syrian majority of the Syrian people who have, risen up against this dictatorship, that they actually have no hope. The hope that they had, it's either between this dictatorship or this opposition that is mainly based on Muslim Brotherhood and Salafis who would come and replace that regime. And the majority were left without any third choice. Like, for example, now, as you can see from the Geneva II conference that we're going to have in January 22nd, who are the group that are invited? It's very sad that after 3 years and all this destruction and 150,000 lives lost and over 2,200,000 refugees, and another 7 million internally displaced, that they did not get the lesson. Now we're going to have the people coming to the Geneva II conference, they're going to be the Syrian regime, and on the other side you're going to have the Muslim Brotherhood, you're going to have, they were trying to convince the Salafis to come. Well, that's a great future for a great hope for the Syrian people on the ground. This is why when a lot of people are very surprised when they hear why the Syrian people, a lot of people in Syria who rose against the regime are now siding with the regime. There was even a NATO report, a few months ago, saying that 70% of the people now in Syria prefer the Syrian regime, not because they are with the dictatorship, of course not, but because they prefer the devil they know to the devil they don't. They are seeing that those, areas held under rebel controls, people are getting whipped. In Raqqa, for example, women are not even allowed to go see male doctors. A lot of people are getting their heads cut for no reason, cut off for no reason. So we are seeing all those torturing, videos of the kidnapping priests, kidnapping nuns. They're attacking, as I said yesterday, the historic town of Ma'lula, which is, it's a symbol of Christianity. It's the only place in the world where they still speak the language of Jesus Christ. And just for no reason. The only reason is that they're going to attack anyone who does not share their perverted belief of Islam. And this is very sad. Syria is not like any country. Syria is a beautiful mosaic of people made up of many ethnicities, of different sects, of different religions. And those minorities actually make up nearly 50% of the Syrian population. And we have to respect that and accept that if we're going to have a genuine democracy, we have to accept pluralism, that all people, and actually the only people that Geneva II conference could work, if we allow all people, all opposition groups who believe in our universal values, in genuine democracy, that we're going to have all people equal under the rule of law, regardless of ethnic group, religion, sects, and gender. This is the most important. If they are not ready to sign up to that, and I'm sure none of the Islamic group would even accept that, then what is this going to be for? What are those people going to Geneva II for? It's just waste of time, money, energy, and people are going to continue dying on the ground. So I would like to, let Mr. Clad again speak. Thank you very much.
Ribal, thank you very much. What I'd like to do, with your approval, ladies and gentlemen, is invite each of my colleagues here to speak for about the same length of time that Ribal has done. And then as they speak, please think about some of the questions you might like to ask them. I wonder if I could invite Dr. Nasser to be the next speaker as we progress along. And I think it'd be useful to give the audience both your own personal views and then also try, to the extent you can, reflect your own political position and country as appropriate. So let's start.
Thank you very much. I think to start with, I think we have to look at to learn from our experience, to learn of how to sort conflicts. And if we look at any conflicts that's happening, especially in the Middle East, if we look at Iraq, Libya, Syria, and others, we see that conflicts are resolved by either two ways. One, either by direct intervention, which is usually using a force, or secondly, by, if that failed, or even before that, they use sort of political mediation. And both of those solutions have not been successful so far in any of the conflicts. The reason for that, because who is the actual victim of this conflict? These are the people. And both those solutions doesn't actually, they don't actually serve or help those people. Because like in Iraq or in Libya, when there is intervention, of course, they destroy everything, and they put the best democracy in the world system, and then they think things will work by itself. It doesn't work. People are not involved in any way. They're involved later on. The second thing, by mediation, like what happened in Sudan, for example, and other places, and what they're trying to do now in Syria, is basically they talk to the conflicting parties. So we have the regime on one side, and then you have the other opposition, et cetera, from the other side. Okay, they reach an agreement, but where are the people there? They have no voice. And every side, they say, okay, I'm speaking for the people. So this is what we learn, and we are not learning from the history. If we look at the case, for example, in Syria, it is the same thing. We have to understand, to fully understand, or to put some sort of to think how to go forward. Let's look at, we have to really look at what has happened. So we have, first of all, to analyze what is really the problem. I mean, do we know actually what is the problem and why this conflict has started? And we should not look just in matter of 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. We have to go back to the history of the problem and try to identify what's the problem. Second, we have to see who are the conflicting parties, internal conflicting parties, the stakeholders internally. Third, we have to see who are the regional conflicting parties, and fourth, the international conflicting parties. Fifth, we have to look at the media. Sometimes the media actually are not helping in these conflicts, and in fact, the media sometimes is used by one side to attack the other side, or to create some sort of problem for the people. In fact, I have raised this question in a Brussels forum this year to actually panelists who represent the Security Council, who represent the European Union, and I said that this is a problem. If it needs to be addressed, it has to be addressed. If it's going to be addressed by the Security Council, the Security Council has to, first of all, to prevent this intervention from outside. So that means we go back to the problem and who are the stakeholders in this problem. Secondly, if we look at the refugees, now we're talking about 2,200,000 or more of refugees. Now those refugees, at that time, I'm talking about in March, the European Union had spent about $1.5 billion just for the refugees. Ban Ki-moon was asking for $4.5 billion for the refugees, to take care of the refugees. Even if this money is poured down to these refugees, what will happen to those refugees? These refugees still will be outside. Now they need education, they need, if I'm a head of a family, I need to take care of my family. How do I do that in a tent or in a camp? I cannot get a job, I cannot work. So the problem will escalate actually. The only way that those people have to go back. And the solution actually has to focus from the problem and focusing on the people rather than focusing just on the conflicting parties. The only way is the intervention of the regional side or the international side doesn't happen in every conflict unless the conflict starts. So you have to sort of retrack and go back and try to see what wrong thing was done by those policymakers, what wrong thing was done by those who have actually intervened in this problem, whether they're regional or international. And to curb that and to focus, actually the solution should focus more in the people. I don't see any hope in Geneva too. And I think, okay, even if they arrive to a solution, this solution will be just to satisfy sort of the two parties. Even if reach that, I think, okay, if there is some sort of peace that could be happening, I think that money should be poured down to create sustainable development and build a human rights-based approach to development, making sure that people actually are free to practice what they can practice. Forget about just the politics side, but they have to look at all the other sides. We have to look to economy, environment, culture, all the human rights, etc. I'll stop here and give the chance for it. Thank you.
Nasser, thank you for those views. I was struck how your perspective, coming from Bahrain, being in the Gulf, and seeing these issues coming up not just past year, but in the very recent decade, noticing how all of the issues are intertwined. I wonder if we could ask for your comments, madam. I've just learned that she was ambassador in Washington for 5 years. I'd never met her, and I was surprised because it clearly shows I don't travel in the right circles, but there we are.
Thank you very much. Cyprus is the closest member state of the European Union to Syria. The distance between the shores of Cyprus and the shores of Syria are something like 120 kilometers. So not only we have had very long-standing historical, I would say, relations with Syria, of course with all the other countries in the region, with Lebanon and Israel and Egypt and the rest. But we have really felt the consequences of this tragic, terrible war that has ravaged the whole country. It has brought destruction. We're talking about I don't know how many trillion US dollars will be needed to rebuild what has been destroyed by weapons. We have 150,000 deaths, as we have, of course, this list is increasing by day. We have, all in all, over 7 million or 8 million displaced and refugees altogether. Most of them are children, and this is something we have to take into account. There are millions of children right now, as we speak, in this beautiful environment, that they are deprived of education. They are deprived of the very basic needs that each and every one and our families enjoy. So this is a tragedy that has been going on in front of the eyes of the world. We see it in our television sets, and we may change the channel because it's too traumatic and too tragic. But who is responsible for all that? And I can speak now as a free person because I'm not a foreign minister anymore. We are talking about a UN system that we all agreed that this UN system will take care of the different conflicts around the world. The UN Charter is very, very specific on how member states should conduct themselves in their international relations, when they can use force, how they can use force, when collective action is taken, and what is the role of the Security Council. Everything is very clear. I'm sure that most of you around this room have read the UN Charter. It's a very simple and very straightforward document. So are we really moving in the direction that the Charter has prescribed? Are the members of the United Nations, are the permanent members of the United Nations moving in that direction? We're talking about these extremist groups. They are armed. Who is giving them arms? We know. What are we doing about it? We have to be more honest about international relations. We have to be more honest as to who are contributing towards a solution and who are contributing towards further deepening this conflict. We have the Geneva meeting in January. Why are we talking about a failure? If we know that it's going to be a failure, what are we doing about it? So there is a lot of hypocrisy in international relations, and I wanted to point to this hypocrisy because the only way that we can move forward and have a more peaceful world is if we say the truth and if we point to the real culprits who are really responsible for bringing countries to these tragic situations. Thank you.
I think absolutely well said. I think our friend from Cyprus has really helped us a great deal by throwing a very harsh and honest and realistic glare on the shortcomings of what we sometimes call rather fancifully the international system, which in response to the Syrian atrocious situation has essentially been frozen, paralyzed, or worse. I wonder if I could invite my two guests to the right to offer their own particular views and to keep focus on this question of what are the remedial prospects in the system as we have it with all its shortcomings to do something, or are we, as the former foreign minister said, condemned to just watch this on television knowing that it will continue to be an ulcer and that the consequences will be much worse?
Well, I'm not an expert on these matters. I have looked at it as a citizen. And my first question to myself and to others is, who has sold the weapons? And how much is the responsibility of all European countries interfering when you look at who is shooting and who is selling and producing weapons still after the most great tragedy of the last century. We had started creating the Council of Europe and an adjunct committee called Western European Union. And this body should have controlled arms production. It was resolved 1 year ago, as it was not possible to have this control. So if I may say, there is one utopia for this century. Stop producing weapons and stop by the nuclear. And one utopist, Albert Jacquard, it was his vision for this century. Nobody should have the nuclear weapon. And as we are now debating on Syria, if you have a look at the map, Syria is a huge country. And in my opinion, you cannot debate only Syria. It interferes to Turkey. I have been 35 kilometers on the Syrian border on the Turkish side, where the refugees are coming, where people want to have peace. If you are looking at the negotiations between Iran, what was the outcome and what was the applause for those who concluded the agreement with Iran? And who was opposing? So these are fundamental questions, of course. Now Syrian population is suffering. We can do one thing as an act of cultural diplomacy. That is avoiding these terrible stereotype reportings. You have in the press the stereotype of dictator, such as if it was one single way of governance. It is different everywhere. And then we had the report of the Emir of Qatar having this act towards the opposition leaders. It was presented in the European press as some kind of relief. Now they will be able to talk. Now there is somebody who had federated the opposition. And who was the opposition? Nobody was looking at it. And it was nowhere related in the press that the opposition was composed by extremists, and extremists active in Africa, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in so many countries. So Ribal Al-Assad had, in his introductory speech to this conference, one very beautiful say on moderate Islam. I think that should be our goal. How can we have a moderate way to promote Islam, and how can we make the distinction between what is extremist, what is fundamentalist, what is not according to the rules of a civilized world? What can we do in the immediate? Well, we can have a more generous acceptance of refugees. And we can only have an intervention that is not basic to the real conflict. But for the moment, I don't have so much hope that we can stop the fighting now, immediately, unless there is a whole solution for the region.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be part of the panel. It's such a distinguished group of representatives. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jean-Paul Adam. I'm the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Seychelles. I know that Seychelles sometimes needs a bit of explaining because we are a very small country. We are, in fact, the smallest of the 54 members of the African Union. We are the smallest African country. We are an island state just off the east coast of Tanzania in the Indian Ocean. Now, my intervention, I think I would like to focus very much on the view of the Syrian crisis in the context, I think, also of African politics and African diplomacy. And I know that most African countries, we discussed this recently in a recent African Union meeting, we certainly see the situation in Syria very much looking at similar scenarios that have taken place in Africa, most notably in Libya. And the concerns that many African countries are linked to the Libyan situation. The Libyan situation, thankfully, was resolved quicker, in a sense, but there have been a number of ramifications for the region, which I think have to be borne in mind when we're thinking of the Syrian situation. If there was all these problems in Mali, in the Sahel, a lot of it was following from the disintegration which happened in Libya, the small arms that were now available to radical groups in Mali, which were not available before, many which were stolen, pillaged, and which were trafficked following the Libyan conflict. The Central African Republic, in the same scenario, during the period when Libya was still stable, a lot of these different groups, some of them were funded by Gaddafi, others were radical groups, but there was stability generally. But once Libya fell, this led to even more infighting among the groups, and now you have the problem that happened in Mali. You have the follow-on problem that is now happening in the Central African Republic. And on the eastern side of Africa, you have increased arms that are available for radical groups such as Al-Shabaab. And we are seeing in the Eastern African region more traffic in small arms. There are more interceptions of arms that are being moved, and most of them are originating in that northern Libyan area. And it has taken a while for this destabilization to continue. But in a region like Africa, where already most states are not necessarily very strong, there are a lot of fragile states. The Syrian conflict, for example, has a huge potential to also destabilize the wider region, depending on how it pans out. And I think definitely from an African perspective, the concern is always, how do you, first of all, stop the violence? Because every day when we see what's going on, we are all absolutely dismayed. Because to see that level of violence against women, against children, against innocent people, and I thank Ribal Al-Assad for giving us such a clear presentation of the scale of the difficulties that are being faced there. So the first priority is obviously you stop the violence. This is going to be very difficult in Syria because you have groups, the third force, the radical force, which perhaps have no interest in stopping fighting. And that is the challenge. And if we take it the situation in Africa, in both Mali and the Central African Republic, the only way, these started as political problems between, in both those countries, started as political problems between a ruling group and an opposition group. Then once the destabilization occurred, you had the radicals, the fundamentalists that jumped into the scene and became a third force. In those two countries, it is the same. And the only way that we have managed to deal with this at the African level is through intervention. Even in Africa, there has not been the ability to intervene directly in the region. This is why France has come in, but with the consultation with African Union leaders, and also as a preparation towards the deployment of African Union forces. Now, this is very important because this will allow, we hope, and certainly in Mali there has been a degree of success, and we are hopeful that there will be success also in the Central African Republic in establishing basic, cessation of hostilities. Once the hostilities are, once there is no longer fighting, you can then go for the political solution, and there it's where I think many of the proposals that we can bring about in terms of cultural diplomacy, about breaking down the barriers between religions, between ways of thinking, of how you're going to organize the state. You can have that conversation when people are not being killed every day. It's very difficult to have that conversation, or at least in an effective way, when there is conflict going on. The problem with Syria, and here I'm going to be very honest, we're one of the smallest countries in the UN, but in the Syrian conflict, one of the other problems is that behind the scenes there is also the issue of the states that are in the Security Council that are mediating, and they have to. Don't get me wrong, they have to mediate, but the fact that they are in the Security Council, that there is the United States and there's also Russia that are both mediating, means that this issue of perhaps having, for example, a neutral intervention force will be extremely difficult under Chapter 7 of the UN Security Council, which is how the forces were deployed in Central African Republic and in Mali. So the question of how you end the hostilities is the first question, the most crucial, the most difficult, I think, in the context of the Syrian question. Thank you very much.
Minister, thank you, and the previous speaker for, again, a very able look at the issue from the perspectives. I mean, just think, here we have Seychelles, Africa Union, Luxembourg, Europe, Cyprus, both Europe and Eastern Mediterranean, Bahrain, the Gulf, and of course, Ribal from Syria, currently resident in London. I think the issues are stark. I'm very struck by the way in which each has referred to different elements of toxicity, how toxic the effect of this brutal war is on not just the country itself and the generation, these enormous numbers of refugees, and the harm and the suffering, but rather in addition, the fact that it is having such a terrible and deleterious effect on their own regions, and throwing again, as the former foreign minister said, the shortcomings of the international system, so described, into sharp relief. I wonder if, with the prerogative of the chair, we could invite any questions. We only have a short time, but if there's anyone who'd be interested, please do now. I believe, I don't know whether there's a microphone they can use. And if, where is it? Yeah. And I'd be very grateful if you could please just very quickly confine yourself to an immediate question, a lot of questions, and identify yourself as well, please. Sir.
My name is Ögmundur Jónasson. I come from Iceland. I'm a former Minister of Interior there. What should be the objective of the international community? Is the first and only objective to stop the war immediately? And if so, how should that be done? By military intervention or by negotiation? We are told that at a negotiation table in Geneva, democratic Syria will not be present. Only the fighting factions, which do not represent democracy. Are you saying that we should not have such negotiations? Or what should be done? Should there be other kinds of pressures, international pressures put on Syria, what are you suggesting? I agree that, of course, we should be asking who is or has been selling the arms. We learned in the papers that the German government or the German companies who are providing Syria, I don't know which party, with chemicals that were being used in chemical warfare. So I agree with you that this is a fundamental question. But I want to know, are you opposing the negotiations that are going to take place in Geneva, or are you suggesting some other kind of international pressure?
I invite Ribal Al-Assad to respond, and anyone else from the panel, and just invite you to please keep your remarks very short.
Thank you very much for the question. Okay, no, I would like to clarify that, of course, I'm not against any negotiations. We are for negotiations. This is why we are here, because we are always for diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, any kind of diplomacy. But we also have to be pragmatic. If we're going to have a Geneva II conference and you're going to have the Syrian regime, a dictatorship, on one side, and on the other side, you're going to have Salafi or Muslim Brotherhood, all these groups. Where is the solution? How can I sit? I mean, how could the Syrian people have hope with a solution coming out of this kind of Geneva II? I think the solution, as I said previously, the Geneva II should invite, I don't know if it's still time for them, but they should invite all groups who believe in our, not just to say it, they have to come there and commit to it, to commit to our universal values, as head of human rights, who would agree and sign on, a charter saying that we agree on equality of all citizens, regardless of ethnic group, sex, religion and gender. This is very important. But I don't think, and this is where you will see that I don't think, for example, that any Salafi group or Muslim Brotherhood, they would agree on equality of gender, for example, or equality of sects or religions. This is impossible. They would not agree to that. So this is why I'm saying, what kind of democratic future are we looking forward to under this kind of Geneva II conference? The Geneva II conference, I said, would give us all hope if they would invite all groups who genuinely believe in those values.
Good. Thank you, Ribal. Ambassador, or rather Foreign Minister.
Thank you. Very, very, very important question, very pertinent question. Let me tell you what I had suggested some year and a half ago in one of our foreign affairs councils in the European Union, to put all our efforts as UN, EU, and all other organizations and individual countries to cease the fire and to establish a very strong peacekeeping force in Syria. I had a very strong support from another member of the advisory board, Erkki Tuomioja. We are both firm believers that there is still a chance of putting something in place which is within the framework of the United Nations, give all the weight and all the money to a very strong peacekeeping force, effect a ceasefire, and I think that all the countries that are at this point, they are sending weapons to the different factions, they have to be able to convince them to stop the fighting. We're spending billions and billions and billions for the refugees, for the needs of the refugees. Can't we spend this money also to have a peacekeeping force? And then, of course, we have already Lakhdar Brahimi. I know him personally. He's an excellent diplomat. He's an excellent negotiator. Let's give a chance to negotiations. Let's put also all our support as international community to negotiations and to establishing a peacekeeping operation.
As briefly, please, and then we'll
yes,
turn to at least two more questions.
Very briefly, I think the first thing that should be done, the success of Geneva II, is to stop this war, number one, and to make sure there is no intervention from outside, especially from the radical groups, if they can, in a way, curb their effect inside. But that's not enough. That will be just the beginning, because then there should be a big program, first of all, to bring back all the refugees. Those refugees have to go back through a proper program for sustainable peace. And thirdly, which is very important, is to focus on the proper development of the people. Because at the end, any conflict starts from the people. If you don't meet their demands, still this conflict will continue. So a proper sort of sustainable development based on human rights that will create democracy from within the country, not imported democracy from outside, but a democracy that people will choose and will be happy with. Thank you.
Nazir, thank you for focusing on the vital question of repatriation. There's a question back there from this gentleman, and then this gentleman in front, and then you, sir, raising your hand there at the third. Okay, so we could keep it quick and brisk. Please identify yourself and keep the questions short, please.
Yes, thank you. Ayaz Kalnic, I'm chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Latvian Parliament. When we look at this region, there are a lot of different reasons for conflict, tribal, economic, political, but the one we hear about the most is religious, and particularly the conflict between Sunnis and Shiites. And for non-Muslims, it's sometimes hard to understand the intensity of this conflict, except when we look back in the history of Europe between Catholics and Protestants. Do you see this issue being resolved in some way? And isn't this one of the core problems that leads to so much violence there?
Is this a question directly for Ribal?
For anyone who's ready to answer it.
Ribal, do you want to keep it short? Sorry, we've got the short answer.
Thank you very much, sir. Yes, I think this is a main problem that we're having actually in Syria and the whole region, because when the Arab Spring has started, the Gulf countries, instead of looking for another way to counter Iran's strength, I mean, in the region, and they have turned to sectarianism. They have turned to split the region into sectarian lines between Shias and Sunnis. And this is actually the core of the problem today. Some satellite TV channels were set up all over, they're paid by money coming from Saudi Arabia and other countries, that promote daily religious hatred and incite on religious violence and sectarian violence. You heard, for example, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, who came out and said we have to wage jihad against those infidel Shias and Alawites. He said the Alawites are more infidels than Christians and Jews. And this kind of rhetoric, we haven't found anyone in the West, any leaders to come out and say, we do not want to hear, condemn what he's saying, and to say, to tell a country where he's residing, like Qatar, to tell them we don't want to hear such kind of rhetoric, which is not only bad between, for Muslims, relation between Muslims themselves, but for the whole world. Again, we have heard the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, as I've said yesterday, who came out and also incited Muslims and said it's duty for all Muslims to burn churches in the Middle East. And again, we have not found one leader in the world to come out and say, condemn his statement and to, tell Saudi Arabia's government that your high authority in Saudi is promoting, hatred again and sectarian religious violence against other, between religions and sects. This is where the whole problem is. In politics, we could all disagree on things, we could all fight, we could all go to even have war between each other, but at the end of the day, we could come back and resolve on negotiating table and resolve our problems.
Thank you.
In religion, and mainly in Islam, just my last point, this is very difficult to do, because once you call someone an infidel or an apostate, it's very difficult. What are you going to come and say again? Oh, sorry, we were mistaken. Sorry, you were not actually that. When we talked to you, because in Islam, when you say this person is an apostate, you have to kill him. In their perverted ideology, you have to kill that person. So what are we going to do now about it? How are they going to retract what they have been promoting for the past 3 years and inciting, against for the past 3 years?
Thank you, Ribal. Your point particularly about the silence from the West for these extreme comments, as if we have one rule for one set of discourse, and yet from a particular big, wealthy kingdom, somehow we're meant to look the other way. This gentleman in front, question, keep it short, please identify yourself, and then we have several more, so let's keep up a good pace.
Thank you very much. My name is Esfahani. I'm director of a private Islamic Studies Institute in Berlin. I have a question about the relation between Salafi groups in Europe, especially in Germany, and in Syria. Because of my work in these Islamic Institute for Islamic Studies, and or internet site, I have experienced that there is a very, very strong hatred against any moderate solution for Syria between converted Salafi Muslims in Europe and especially in Germany. What do you think about this relationship?
Okay, thank you. And again, I'll invite any response. It seems to me you're directing your question to someone here, Mr. Assad?
I don't know.
I mean, it seems to me it's almost a statement as much as a question, and it's a troubling one. If anyone would like to comment on that, perhaps in another question, that would be fine, but thank you. The next question, please, back there.
My name is Alexander. I'm a Master's of Law student at the University of Cambridge. My question emanates from a pattern. Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, Syria. These are countries that have a different form of government away from what we'll probably see in other Western world. And my question is, how do you draw the balance between culture, sovereignty, democracy, the definition of democracy and intervention? Because
culture, sovereignty.
Culture, sovereignty, definition of democracy and intervention. You spoke of intervention during the war. Can't we prevent intervention before the war by redefining democracy in the UN Charter to accommodate all these other forms of statehood, and not necessarily that which goes with 4 years or 5 years, and prevent all these things that happen?
Got it, thank you. That's a big, big question, and we're probably going to have to truncate the answer. I'll invite maybe Dr. Nasser to have a shot, and then proceed back to some other questions. Yes, please, and you, sir, first, perhaps.
Yes,
do you want to go first? Who goes first? Let's not have a conflict over who goes first.
Okay. I think it's a big question. I mean, this is a whole course that has to be taught for that. But to be very short, I think, yes, the answer to your question, that you can prevent intervention. And any conflict anywhere is attributed to two things, either sustainable development or human rights. Combination of this. Sustainable development, you're talking about political, economical, environmental, cultural, and social, and human rights. If you can take care of all of this, and if you can develop a sustainable development based on human rights in any society, you will have no conflicts, and you don't need intervention. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to, because I think you picked on a lot of very interesting points, and the inherent problem of any form of intervention is that in the UN Charter we speak of sovereignty, and sovereignty means you are not going to interfere in the affairs of other states. But there are also the shared values, the shared values of democracy, the shared values of equality, etc., etc. But it is very difficult to define in such a way these values whereby they can be universal, because we've seen in recent times, we've seen that there are countries that can be democratic, but still have even racist policies and in the way that they work. So it's very dangerous and difficult to actually define democracy in a sort of universal sense and these kind of things. And I think what is important is in each state to create the space for democracy to occur in the terms of that state, because democracy is not actually a goal, it's a process. Yeah. It's something which happens as part of a process. And what happens in states like Syria is that there's been a breaking of the links in this process. Unfortunately, once you have got past that, then the only way to deal with it, I think at this stage, is through some form of intervention. Now, when I say intervention, it doesn't necessarily mean military, but there has to be an outside intervention to allow the current conflict to stop and allow the rebuilding of some of these processes. But how to rebuild those processes has to be something which is internal in each state. I think otherwise, if it's imposed from the outside, it will not be sustainable. It may be an interim solution, but it will not be sustainable.
Thank you, Minister. That's a very important addendum. Now, look, we're bumping up against time. Ribal Al-Assad needs to go to the airport shortly. So I wonder, any remaining questions, if we could hear all the remaining questions, say another two, and then allow for some brief answers and let this man catch his plane. Yes, in the back.
Good evening. I'm I'm Joanna Rozpadowski.
Speak up a bit,
I'm
Joanna.
Joanna Rozpadowski. I have a question about...
Speak up, Aunt Joanna.
So two mechanisms were mentioned, the military and the political mechanism for the solution of conflict. I wonder what happened to the judicial mechanism. The 2002 Rome Statute accounts for some of these questions. There is individual responsibility of the heads of state for crimes perpetrated against humanity. I wonder whether any consideration could be given to the Rome Statute and the reporting, direct reporting to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, the heads of state who violate the UN Charter, for instance, or the core humanity laws. And
thank you. That's a very helpful thing. We'll put it in a category called ICC and the whole question of breaches of formal international humanitarian law. Winston Peters, I see in the back, the former New Zealand Foreign Minister. Welcome, sir.
Mr. Moderator, what I want to know is how come a shift in Wall Street investment following the Western financial crisis and the movement in high cost of unaffordable food in the Middle East end up being called an Arab Spring or a search for democracy?
Minister, as usual, a tight, tough question. Just to paraphrase it, a crisis and a real spike in food prices at the same time occurred with the Arab Spring, and yet very few people, even those quite well informed about the region, draw the connection. Very good, sir. The last question is from Mackenzie. Keep it short, mate.
Mackenzie Atuti. I'm a master's student in law, international law and human rights. My question goes to Ribal and the friend. My question is, does Sharia law make room for human rights? Because I heard the last speaker was talking about internal democracy. They don't want democracy coming from outside. And I know democracy it will be difficult to practice within Islamic states. So I really want to know what kind of democracy you're talking about that you want to come from inside, and how do you practice that democracy without the rule of law, without human rights? And because I know Sharia law is what you really work with.
Good, thank you. I think what we're going to do is invite a response from any of my colleagues here to any of these previous three questions, and then with the chair's permission, we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I think the question of human rights, there is no contradiction between Sharia law and human rights. See, the problem with human rights, I have a book which is published, Universal Model for Human Rights, and it answers most of the questions you have. But basically, human rights, a lot of people mistake human rights, that's okay, it's contradiction with culture, etc. Human rights has to be built within that culture. So certain things which is in one society is not considered, could be considered in another society. But you have to look at the spirit of that. In fact, one of the slogans of human rights, which is written in the UN, was actually said by Imam Ali, which was said like 1,400 years ago, talking about that we are equal. Your brothers, either equal in humanity or in religion. So humanity is first, then religion after that. But there is a lot of things. I mean, we can talk about it later on if you want, but due to the time.
Again, what I'd like to do, Ribal, if you could address any thoughts that occurred in those three questions.
Yes.
ICC, question of food prices, and also Sharia compatibility with democratic development. Then if we could come down to the rest of the people.
Yes, the first thing that I wanted to make myself very clear again, because I said previously, one of the gentlemen sitting in the front row said, that not all Muslims, of course, believe that an apostate should be killed. Not all Muslims, only Muslims, extreme Muslims who have a perverted ideology of Islam. This is, we have to be very clear about it. And regarding Sharia law, I personally don't, I don't think that there's, we have to go back how Sharia law came. Sharia law, when it came in Islam, it was an introduction to democracy. It was introduction to democracy. It was a kind of laws that people needed at that time in Arabic tribes and other to be able to survive, and not to have the law of jungles whenever they needed, there were tribes whenever they needed money or others, they would go invade another tribe and take their women, take their slaves, take their cattle. This was not right. So it was kind of laws that they have to, to live, I mean, like all other religions. But today, also there's another thing in Islam, it's called ijtihad. Ijtihad means we have to be able to evolve. not to stay. This is exactly against the Salafi ideology. The Salafi ideology, Salafi means stay stuck in the past. Salafi means the past. And they don't believe in any evolution. And this is why we are, I'm personally against, those people who are practicing Sharia law because they do not understand what it means. Today democracy actually in a country like Syria is the only way. As I said, in Syria with all these different ethnic groups and sects and religions, is the only way that could protect those groups, to live all together in peace and harmony, in a pluralistic society, and again, as I said, all equal under the rule of law.
Thank you. Moving along to you, Minister for Kent.
On ICC, I think it's a very, very big chapter, and the problem there is that not all member states of the United Nations have become parties to the ICC statute. And until, that's my opinion, until and unless this is an obligation on the part of all member states of the United Nations to be a party, for crimes, for these particular crimes, we're talking about crimes against humanity, crimes of genocide. How can one say that I don't want to be involved in that? Everyone, every member state should be obliged, if they are members of the United Nations, to be a party of the Statute of Rome. So until and unless all countries are part of the ICC, then I think there will be a limit to what the ICC can do for these horrific crimes that are taking place.
Moving right along.
Thank you. I also just wanted to come in. Sorry.
I think we might defer to your colleague. Go ahead, please, and then.
Well, I think we should perhaps go back in history concerning nation building. Sometimes the borders are not according to the ethnic consistence of a group. And that was the case also in Europe. And there was one very wise decision in 1980 between Germany and France that was not to change borders. So, are the borders now not to be changed according to the new situation? There are talks about Great Turkmenistan. There is many movement in this region, and how is the religious conflict to be seen in such a way, creating a sovereign state that is unified by its culture, perhaps would be one long-term perspective for avoiding conflicts.
Minister, thank you. Sorry to cut you off a little bit earlier.
No, that's fine.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond very quickly on the ICC question, which I think is very important. Like most international laws, it is a result of a compromise. And the ICC, as my colleague minister has pointed out, and not all countries are member. For countries that are not member, they may still be referred. So the case of Syria can be referred to the ICC, but it has to be done by the Security Council, where the problem would arise in this particular instance for reasons that I've already stated. And I think that it is important, and which goes back to the previous statement made by the gentleman from the University of Cambridge, because in these kind of international conventions, you are trying to the degree possible to talk about some universal agreed definitions for certain things. What is a crime against humanity? You are trying to define these things. It's very difficult. There is no agreement overall. And the problem as well is that in the application, there are issues as well. And I know there's been a lot of press coverage recently for the African Union's position, for example, on Kenya and President Kenyatta. But the African Union's position is actually one, and this doesn't get heard in the media, but I was there. The position is not to say that President Kenyatta should not be tried. It's the question of the process of how the law is done. And this, again, in the case of Syria, how we use the ICC is a problem of the process. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think this panel is a perfect example of the genius of the ICD. I can tell you that most conversations in Washington about Syria are fairly predictable. You can tell who's going to say what, more or less when, and where the incremental changes in position will occur or not. but the richness of the viewpoints here is very, very satisfactory, including the richness of the questions. And I wonder if you could join with me in thanking the panelists for a really great presentation.